Let's talk about the actions block. Each action is a specific set of instructions that ManyChat follows when rendering this action in the flow builder. And you can make API calls through this and configure form fields and other stuff, which we're going to go through. So when you come to this, you'll see a list of actions that you already have, or if you're creating, you'll see that list of actions over here, and there on the right, you will see the actions block JSON. This will get updated as you configure actions and click on the save button. So let's get started with configuring an action. When you open this, you'll see a bunch of fields. There's the name of the action, which should be unique. There's the title. This is what shows up inside the flow builder when somebody is selecting an action for your app. A general description that also shows up, and then guidance. If there are specific steps that need to be followed for configuring an action which the users need to know, you would add guidance over there. And with guidance, you can provide line breaks by adding the \n for providing a line break in there. So we'll just start creating one. Let's just call this address creation, and then we add this. Add a new address, adds a new address to the backend. There's no guidance required here, so we can leave that. Now, the main things that you configure in an action are the form fields and the HTTP request. So let's get started with the form fields first. I'm going to click on plus, and then it shows you these different options for each form field. You have a type where you can select the type of the form field. There is string, number, and select. Select only shows up if you actually have sources configured for your application. So let's just start with a field type address, and let's just say contact first name, and then if you want a particular field to be required, you can mark this as required. The default value will go away, and then when you're configuring an action, ManyChat won't let you save the action till you've provided a value. If you don't want it required, just leave it blank, and then you can provide a default value. If you don't add anything over there, by default it's just a blank value. So we're going to go back and add another field here, and let's select type select. So when you do select, you see this other thing called sources show up. And now let's say this is called state value, state, and the sources is basically a drop down, and it'll show you a list of all the sources that you've defined. Now for this example, we've just defined one called stateless, which is basically just a list of states in the United States. So I'm going to select that. Again, the same thing goes for this required or default. Once you're done with the fields, you can move on to the HTTP requests. Now, when you're configuring the action, your form fields will show up in the order in which they are defined over here. So if you wanted state to be before contact first name, again, if you see this little symbol, that means those items are draggable. So you can drag and drop this up above that. And when you save it, it'll save the state field before the contact first name, and that'll get rendered on the UI before the contact first name. So let's move on to the HTTP request. This is fairly similar to other HTTP requests that you've configured. So you have a method here. Let's say that we're posting this. You put in your URL and specify your payload. And I am just going to do this. First name. And put this in double quotes here. And then let's say that I am just passing the state value right now. State value. What's the name of my variable? And you can always go back, refer to the form fields to see the variable that you created. This is now just a sample payload, but as you edit this JSON in here, it actually shows you whether it's a valid JSON or not. So you've done that. You can go and create a request header in here. So let's say that I just want to add a content type header over here. I could say content type. Again, over here is going to be application JSON. So that header comes through, and now we'll come to the request mapping. Request mapping is an optional section for a HTTP request, and in some cases you may not have a request mapping. But let's say in this case you did want to create a request mapping where when you create an address, your API sends back the unique address ID from your backend, and you want to store that somewhere in a custom field. So in that case, what you would do is you would create a request mapping. So if you look at this, again, it tells you what type, either be a string or a number. So let's say it's string. We're going to do address ID. And now so the JSON path is the JSON path to the field that comes back in the response in the JSON that you want to map. So let's say in this case, I have a JSON which comes back with a root element called address. And within that, I have ID. I would put that in here, and this would show up as a mapping that you can use to map this value to a particular custom user field in ManyChat. So when I click on save, you see this gets generated over here. Now let's say I had another HTTP request in here. It doesn't have to be just a single one. Maybe after you create the address, you are also sending it to some other backend where you need to verify some other information. You could add another HTTP request over here. Let's say we're again posting the same stuff. Going to be my other api.example.com. Then I have these a very similar payload going in there. You can also use system fields. So let's say I'm using the first name system field. Put that in curly braces, and I'm passing the state, which will again be state value, which was the name of my variable. So over here, you see it shows me an error. So it says it's expecting a comment to that. So I've missed out a comma on this, which is why it's not a valid JSON. I add that, that goes away. So you do have some validation over there. I'm not going to add any request headers or request mapping. It's the same as the previous one. I'm going to click on save. This gets updated, and you see the request array actually has two different HTTP requests going in there. This icon, it means that this is draggable. What ManyChat does is that the order in which you define your HTTP requests, that's the order in which it fires those HTTP requests. So this is not really a good example of that, but just in case you had an example where you wanted this one to get fired before this, you could just rearrange these, click on save, and you see it changes the order in which those things would get fired. So let's say I have this one thing and I want to create an update my address. In this case, I could create the whole thing, or I could just copy this action. And what that does is it pretty much copies everything, including your HTTP requests and your form fields. And so that makes it very easy for you to just go and make just the changes that you want. So let's say I want to change this to update address, and update address over here as well. You can go change the field, and let's say instead of post, I want to do a put over here. I'm going to do the same for the other one also. I'm going to click on save. There's an update address, and there's an address creation actions, two different actions in here. And the same with actions. When somebody installs your app and they want to configure an action from your app, they see a list of actions and it shows up in the order in which they are in the actions block. If you wanted to change the order, these are trackable as well. So you could just push this up and click on save, and you'll see the update address becomes the new one. So this is how you can go ahead and create actions. Works pretty much similar. For other actions, you could change the HTTP request, and that's how you would use this screen to create one or more actions for your